The Ardo String Academy sat nestled in the misty highlands of Strasbourg, its gray limestone walls blanketed in ivy as if time itself had been devoured. It was more than a training ground for musicians. It was a symbol, a fortress of art where names carried centuries of lineage, and every note was scrutinized under the microscope of history and expectation. The dark mahogany corridors echoed with the polished footsteps of dawn, mingling with violin strains that seemed to echo from centuries past. Everything here was steeped in prestige and suffocation. Isabelle Mercier stood before the bronze doors carved with the image of Apollo. For a fleeting moment, she caught her own reflection in the dulled metal. A faded olive linen dress, brown hair loosely tied over one shoulder, thin glasses catching the light from the crystal chandelier above. Slung over her shoulder, her violin case was scratched at the latch and corners, carrying the Guarneri violin her mother, a seamstress who loved Paganini more than dinner, had preserved like treasure. A violin once traded for 2 winters without heating, now stood as her only shield between herself and the storm of prejudice behind that door. Isabelle had grown up in a southern suburb of Lyon, in a cramped apartment where the sewing machine never stopped and musical notes competed with clanging pots. She learned violin by incandescent light, taught by her father through sound, not textbooks. When she received the Orphy Scholarship, meant for artists with nothing but passion, she moved to Strasbourg, lived in an old dormitory, and buskied on the streets to afford strings and practice sheets. To her, Ardo wasn't just a dream, it was her last chance. If this place rejected her, no other door would open. The chamber hall where auditions were held glowed golden under 3 towering crystal chandeliers. Velvet-covered chairs in deep navy lined the room. Tall arched windows stretched to the ceiling, casting light on the polished wood floor. The air was thick with the scent of leather, cedarwood perfume, and something sharper, expectation. Scattered students whispered among themselves, eyes darting, judging the newcomer not by her sheet music, but by the brand of her scarf and the condition of her violin case. At the judges' table sat 3 titans of European classical music. In the center, Maestro Adrian Koenig, an Austrian prodigy who had won the Paganini Prize at 18. His midnight blue suit was immaculately tailored, pocket square folded like a 16th note. His slender fingers tapped a Mont Blanc fountain pen against the table, each beat like a metronome in a cold room. To his right sat Professor Elena Rossetti, her silver hair pinned high, infamous for her severity and her credo. Music without feeling is just organized noise. On his left, Dr. Hugo Sattler, a cold, exacting German renowned for discovering talent in nameless villages. The 3 were known as the Iron Triangle. No one knew how they ever agreed, only that no student had defied them and lasted past the first semester. Her name was called Isabelle Mercier. A few heads turned. A student in the back leaned over and whispered just loud enough, "Mercier? Not the wine label, just the girl from Lyon." Scattered laughter followed, not cruel but certainly condescending. She stepped onto the stage, her flat shoes making no sound. Under the spotlight, the olive of her dress turned to mossy green. She stopped at the center of the room, Guarneri in hand, chin resting lightly on the shoulder rest, bow in hand like a prayer. Koenig stared at her, as if her presence were a joke. He spoke, voice cold as thin ice on a lake. "Fräulein Mercier, are you sure this is a violin audition and not a historical costume club meeting?" A few chuckles echoed. He continued without shifting tone. "Paganini, Caprice number 24. Standard tempo 132. No accompaniment. No soul-searching. Just sound." Isabelle said nothing. She took a deep breath and set bow to string. From the first note, the sound burst forth like fire catching oil. Sharp arpeggios, seamless transitions to double stops, then ricochet, the kind of techniques most only dared attempt behind closed doors. The room held its breath. Her sound was not loud, but each note had weight, like falling straight into the listener's chest. At the 5th variation, she slowed ever so slightly, stretching a low E for a heartbeat. A deviation from the score, but not from the truth of her heart. When the final note faded, the silence was absolute. 3 seconds. A student coughed softly, as if to confirm they were still alive. Koenig sat up, laid down his pen, eyes fixed on her. Technically flawless, he said in English. But sterile. He paused, as if weighing a final judgment. No story. Isabel lowered her violin, stood upright, and met his gaze. You asked for Caprice 24. No emotion. No interpretation. Her voice was neither raised nor trembling, but each word sliced like a letter opener through paper. Elena Rossetti let out a quiet chuckle, the first all day. Dr. Sattler nodded, lips pressed tight. She exited the stage, walking down a dark green carpeted hall. As she passed the stone stairway leading to the back garden, a student stepped out, burgundy coat, pearl-polished nails, gaze sliding down Isabel like she was picking from a menu. Is that a real Guarneri? She asked, feigning indifference. Sweet, but old. You should try jazz, it's easier on the ears. Isabel didn't answer. She nodded slightly and walked on. No defense needed. Her music had spoken for her. Rain dusted the sky over Strasbourg. Isabel crossed the damp stone courtyard, violin case resting on her shoulder like a limb. At the entrance stood the blackened bronze statue of Paganini. She paused, gazing at the sculpted face of the long-gone genius. You didn't need pedigree, she whispered. Only heart and strings. The bell of St. Thomas rang in the distance, blending with the rain. Isabel tightened her grip on the case and walked on. Her figure disappeared beneath the vaulted hallway, but her footsteps echoed, like a metronome marking the start of something. This was only chapter 1. Her composition had just begun. The next morning, pale sunlight filtered through the thin curtains of a third-floor window, casting shadows across a dusty wood floor. In a small dorm room at the far end of the hall, Isabel sat upright with her violin, eyes fixed on nothing in particular. On the desk lay her handwritten copy of Caprice No. 6 by Paganini, marked with brown ink, underlines, personal symbols, and reminders. Slow breathing needed for double trill. Outside, the corridor buzzed with footsteps. Second- and third-year students were heading toward the notice board to see ensemble assignments for the upcoming performance cycle. Isabel knew her name might be missing or worse, placed in the background group as support for the soloists. She didn't mind. She only wanted to stand before the orchestra once, even for a single passage. Then came a knock. The door opened to reveal Thibaut Marin, a fourth-year student and artistic aide to the council. Gray sweater, buttoned-up white shirt, and a leather notebook always tucked under one arm. He was the only son of one of the Academy's major patrons, but unlike other heirs, Thibaut rarely spoke unless addressed, always scribbling quietly. Mercier, he said, eyes landing on the violin by the window. The council wants you for an orchestral trial this afternoon. Urgent. Isabel nodded. She didn't ask why. Whether a test or a trap, she understood. At Ardot, rejection often came wrapped in opportunity. The rehearsal took place in Chamber Hall No. 3, smaller than the main concert hall, but acoustically unforgiving. As Isabel entered, eyes turned instantly. A few chuckles escaped at the sight of her familiar linen dress, this time in ash gray. At the podium stood none other than Maestro Koenig. He didn't look at her. His eyes were on Celia Beaumont, the so-called Princess of Ardot, playing the solo of Beethoven's concerto in D major. Celia wore a deep crimson velvet dress and pearls, her bowing elegant as ballet. She was everything Isabel was not: pedigree, sponsorship, favoritism. Celia ended with a long vibrato. The room answered with polite applause. Koenig nodded, then turned to Isabel. Mercier. Alternate. Same passage. She stepped up, placing the sheet music on the stand, formality only. She had memorized that section at 17, rehearsing it in public restrooms for the acoustics. Koenig signaled. Isabel drew her bow. Music began. There was no velvet softness like Celia's. No pearls. No flourish. Just sound. Raw. Sharp. True. Beethoven's notes didn't flow like wine. They exploded like firecrackers. Crisp, questioning, furious. In the second row, a student named Jules, Celia's close friend, murmured, "She plays like she's arguing." But no one laughed. because everyone was listening. When Isabel finished, Koenig said nothing. He turned a page in his notebook, then silently motioned for Celia to step down. After the rehearsal, as Isabel packed her violin, footsteps approached. A voice spoke behind her, no mockery this time, no innuendo. "I don't like how you play Beethoven, but I couldn't stop listening till the last note." She turned. Professor Elena Rossetti. Her hand clutched the gray book. Her eyes held no coldness, only something that looked very much like hope. Isabel bowed slightly. She said nothing. Because she knew, in a place like Ardo, nothing echoes louder than music except the silence of someone who's been moved. That night, in her tiny room, Isabel opened her notebook. In one corner of the page, she added a line in cursive. "They don't know my story yet, but they're starting to listen." And she continued to practice, not to be chosen, but because she never needed to be chosen to know who she was. A crisp morning wind swept through the stained glass windows of Ardo, carrying with it the scent of early snow and pine resin. The Academy's internal bulletin had just been posted on the courtyard notice board. Official lineup for the winter concert. Concert de Liver. 12 names were printed in bold on the white paper, and, as always, Celia Beaumont led the list with the main solo, Ravel's Tsigan. Beneath her name came Jules, Camille, Mathis, all familiar names belonging to cashmere coats, million-euro instruments, and cocktail evenings at donor villas. Isabel stood a few steps away from the board. Her eyes traced the names line by line. She hadn't expected to be first. But when she reached the last name, and her own was still missing, her heart clenched in silence. Behind her, a breezy voice chimed in. "No vintage edition this time, I see." She didn't need to turn to know who it was. Clemence Delorme, third-year student, infamous for her Instagram posts tagged with hashtag Born to Bow and hashtag Violoncelle and Valentino. Clemence smiled. Pushing her sunglasses up like the pale winter sun was the only reason her eyes lifted to look at Isabel. "Ah, don't be sad," she said. "There's always a supporting role for you. Or backstage, maybe." Isabel looked at her for a second, then turned away. She walked across the stone courtyard, past the silent statue of Paganini, and entered the West Building, where Practice Room 7 stood, the one no one wanted because the ceiling leaked when it rained. But that room had something the others lacked. Silence. She took out her violin, placed it on her shoulder, and began to play. Not Ravel, not Beethoven, but Caprice No. 11, rarely performed, too technical to show off, too subtle to impress. But Isabel didn't need an audience. She needed the tautness of the strings, the rasp of the bow against the bridge, and the feel of her fingertips imprinting memory into wood. An hour later, a knock at the door. Isabel stopped, expecting a supervisor. But it was Thibaut Marin, in a dark coat, leather notebook still tucked under his arm. "I'm not on the list," she said first, voice calm, as if reciting the first line of a report for him. Thibaut didn't respond immediately. He stepped in, closing the door softly behind him. The room felt even quieter. Light from the high window reflected off Isabel's glasses, hiding her eyes. "The council," Thibaut said slowly, "couldn't agree on the encore, but Professor Rossetti suggested an unorthodox option." He paused. "They want to try an unannounced solo opening. Not part of the program. No introduction. Just a test. A gauge of audience reaction." Isabel eyed him, skeptical. "You mean a soundcheck roll?" Thibaut tilted his head, half a nod, half not. "Call it what you like. But if the piece is strong enough and the player is real, they won't be able to turn away. They'll have to listen." A moment of silence. "The choice is yours. No one's forcing you. And if you decline, no one will blame you." Isabel placed her violin down and tightened the bow's frog. "What piece?" she asked. Thibaut reached into his inner pocket and pulled out a crumpled sheet of manuscript, handwritten, rushed yet legible. At the top it read, "Variations sur un motif oubli pour violoncelle." No author listed. "Rossetti wrote it during a stormy night," Thibaut said. "She was 19, never published it. Only hands it to students she believes are brave enough to play it without a mask." Isabel took the page, eyes scanning the opening lines. It wasn't meant to dazzle. It started slowly, almost whispering. Not the kind of piece suited for a concert hall where audiences still rustle and settle into their seats. But every chord hinted at something raw, like a memory forgotten behind a locked door. She looked up. When? 3 days, Thibault replied. No spotlight, no name in the program. Just 1 hour before the main concert begins. Isabelle nodded. She didn't ask more. As Thibault left, the door shut behind him with a quiet sound, like an exhale. She began practicing, not for the concert but for herself, for the silence that music needed to tear through. In the room with the leaking ceiling, the violin sounded again, not perfect but alive, fractured, bare. No applause required. And somewhere in a shadowed corner of the main auditorium, Professor Elena Rossetti stood quietly, eyes lifted toward the window where the music of an unchosen girl was brushing against the silence surrounding the favored names. She smiled for the first time in years. 3 days later, the concert de live began with all the grandeur Ardo could summon. Crystal chandeliers blazing from the vaulted ceiling, balconies filled with meticulously made-up faces, cashmere scarves, and expensive perfume. A group of patrons from Paris sat front row. Behind them, judges, faculty, and students, those who knew better than anyone that tonight was more than a concert. It was a quiet battleground of lineages, expectations, and unspoken rankings. The orchestra's tuning echoed through the hall, like a hushed prelude to ceremony. The conductor stepped out, bowed, and received a polite ripple of applause. But before the first baton was lifted, the house lights had yet to fully come on. A voice from the loudspeaker rang out, low and succinct. Before the opening piece, the Academy presents an unpublished work, performed by a guest student. Variations sur un motif oublié, pour violin seul. No name, no introduction, no explanation. Murmurs rustled through the audience. The velvet curtain parted slightly. A slender figure stepped forward under the ambient backlight. No evening gown, no silk scarf, just a simple ash-gray linen dress and a familiar dark wooden violin. Isabelle Mercier. She stood alone at the center of the grand stage. No accompaniment, no orchestra, just her and the Guarneri. The hall gradually quieted. Even those leaning in to whisper fell still. She raised her bow and began. The first sound wasn't a declaration but a whisper, soft as if tiptoeing into the vast space. The opening notes were scattered, like memories half-remembered from a dream. Then came a passage echoing old folk tunes, quiet, lopsided, edged with rawness. A variation followed, sharp, urgent, angry, like a door to the past flung open. Some in the audience shook their heads, not understanding what kind of music this was. But they didn't look away. They couldn't. Isabelle's music wasn't meant to impress. Told a truth. That not everyone came from velvet-lined classrooms and heirloom instruments. Some had practiced music between honking traffic and dripping rooftops. Some had played the violin beside cold stoves, with strings brittle from the weather. At the climax, her instrument trembled like it was weeping. Not out of sorrow, but out of refusal. Refusal to let silence be the end. When the final note faded, there was no immediate applause. Only stillness, a strange kind of silence, not from shock, but because the hall hadn't remembered to breathe. Then, a single clap, not from the front row, but the third-floor balcony. A first-year student, eyes still wet, stood and applauded. Then a second, then the fourth row. By the time the lights returned to full brightness, the entire hall was on its feet. In the wings, Professor Elena Rossetti stood tall. She didn't clap. She simply nodded once, as if witnessing a forgotten manuscript she'd written 20 years ago finally find its true voice. At the judges' table, Maestro Koenig remained seated, his displeasure plain. His hand gripped his pen as if ready to snap it. He turned to Hugo Sattler to speak, but paused when he met his colleague's quiet, unreadable gaze, and said nothing. After the unnamed solo, Isabelle stepped back into the wings. No flowers. No one came to shake her hand. But when she returned for her case, she found a small object placed atop it. A cream-colored envelope, sealed with deep violet wax. The insignia of the Solstice Foundation Paris gleamed under the backstage lights. Inside, a single line: "We would like you to perform at our April gala. Train ticket has been arranged. See." Isabel smiled faintly. She slipped the letter into her pocket, slung her case over her shoulder, and exited through the side door, where there were no spotlights, no cameras. She didn't need anyone to know her name, because tonight the music had spoken for her. The backstage door closed behind Isabel so softly that no one in the concert hall heard it. Outside, the applause still roared like waves reluctant to retreat. But in the corridor behind the stage, where soft light and silence reigned, only the sound of her footsteps echoed across the wooden floor. She didn't know who had left the letter on her violin case, but the slanted, bold, and sharp handwriting, signed only C, reminded her of something Professor Rossetti once said on an early autumn afternoon, speaking to a student about the doors that only open once in a lifetime. Perhaps that door had just opened. Isabel walked past the dressing room, where the light-bulb-framed mirror had reflected countless faces waiting for validation. She didn't stop. She didn't need to see what she looked like after standing before hundreds of people. She knew that feeling couldn't be found in a mirror. At the far end of the hallway, a voice called out, "Mercier." It was Thibaut. He stood beside the wall of photographs, the great artists who had once begun right here, under this same golden, aging light. Isabel stopped, but said nothing. Thibaut stepped closer and nodded slowly. "I've seen players hit every note right. I've seen players with perfect emotion. But rarely have I seen someone play the truth." "Thank you," she replied, her voice steady. He looked at her for a moment, then handed her a thin folder. Not a letter this time, but a photocopied performance contract. The Solstice Foundation's logo was embossed in the corner. Under the artist lineup, Isabel Mercier, invite special. "Rossetti sent this," Thibaut said. "She's not one for giving compliments out loud." Isabel flipped through a few pages and saw a handwritten note in violet ink. "Anyone who can play unnamed music can write their own symphony." Below that, another line: "Don't forget rehearsals in Paris start next week." Isabel nodded lightly. Everything was happening fast, but she didn't feel overwhelmed. Like a perfectly timed note, she knew this wasn't the end, just a change in tempo. Thibaut slipped his hands into his pockets, as if about to say more, but thought better of it. She turned and walked toward the back exit, where the night sky over Strasbourg stretched above, dark and soft as velvet. Just as she opened the door, a group of students crossed the main corridor from the stage. Among them was Celia Beaumont, posture straight as a string tuned to perfect pitch. She was mid-sentence with Jules, but fell silent when she saw Isabel standing there. Their eyes met for a second, not sharp, not bitter, just an acknowledgement. Isabel was no longer the girl not called by name. She was the one who had opened the night, even if her name wasn't printed in the program. Celia looked away first, saying nothing. Jules lingered a moment longer, then gave Isabel a small nod, an unspoken gesture of acceptance. Perhaps the music had touched something that words could not. That night, Isabel returned to the dorm in silence. She opened her case and wiped the strings with a soft cloth. Not rushed, but gently, as if preserving a memory. On the desk, the letter from the Paris gala lay unfolded. Beside it, her worn music notebook, the spine frayed, pages yellowed. She turned to the last page and, in her own handwriting, added a new line. "No need for a grand stage, only a sound honest enough to survive prejudice." She closed the notebook and turned off the light. But in the quiet of the room, the echo of the concert hall still lingered. Not the applause, but something stranger and deeper, the feeling of truly being heard. That unnamed performance would never appear in the Academy's official reports, have no press photos, no trending hashtags. But everyone who was there that night knew something had begun. Not a phenomenon, not a miracle, but a voice stepping out of the shadows, through music. Cold wind swept across the Gare de l'Est platform as Paris wore its steel-gray coat of January. Isabel stepped off the train, violin case slung over one shoulder, gripping her thick, worn notebook tightly. She hadn't brought much: an old canvas suitcase, a few simple outfits, and a piece of music recognized by no one but Rossetti. But, as always, she carried the one thing that mattered most: hands that had learned to fight silence with nothing but strings. A silver-haired man in a gray wool suit and cashmere scarf stood beneath a sign that read, "Invites Foundation Solstice." He was Etienne Darcourt, the Foundation's artistic director, known for bringing talents from Belgian hamlets, Italian backwaters, and Swiss mountain towns to the stages of Berlin and Tokyo. When he saw Isabelle, he didn't extend a hand. Instead, he looked her in the eyes, as though evaluating music that had yet to be played. "Bienvenue à Paris, Mademoiselle Mercier," he said, his voice deep, not distant. "We begin first rehearsal tomorrow morning. Tonight, rest. I trust you know when to speak with your bow and when to let it rest." Isabelle nodded without speaking. By the time the car brought her to the guest artist flat in the 6th arrondissement, light rain had begun to fall. From the balcony, she could see the dome of St. Sulpice and bicycles misted over by January frost. The flat was small, oak-furnished, its walls hung with sketches by artists who had once stayed here. In the corner stood an old cello beside a bookshelf filled with handwritten scores: Chopin, Bartók, and names no one knew. The next morning, Isabelle entered the main rehearsal room of Foundation Solstice, a circular space paneled with northern pine where sound returned like breath. 3 musicians were already there. Aiko, a Japanese pianist. Lars, a Dutch clarinetist. And Nadia, a cellist from Rabat, Morocco, tuning her instrument. None of them looked at Isabelle with doubt or superiority. Just a nod, silent, shared. The kind exchanged between people who know music speaks more than introductions ever could. They began with a newly composed quartet, Lignes Brises, Fractured Lines, by a young Polish composer. The music was jagged, non-linear, blending classical overtones with distorted electronic rhythms. Difficult to listen to. Harder still to play. But at one point, as Isabelle slid her bow across a dissonant diminished third, the group stopped, not by cue, but by instinct. They were being led somewhere. Lars laughed and put down his clarinet. "You just translated a sentence I've never understood in this piece," he said in accented English. Aiko merely nodded, placing her hand over her heart. Nadia shrugged. "You played it like it's a scar you know well." Isabelle didn't know what to say. She simply smiled, for the first time in weeks, a genuine one. The next few rehearsals passed at startling pace. Darcourt never interfered, but always sat in the back row, baton in hand, and used. He didn't praise or correct. He only observed, occasionally nodding or frowning. At the end of the first week, he called Isabelle into his office. A high-ceilinged room, window looking out onto Rue de Vaugirard. On the wall, a black and white photograph, a young girl playing violin blindfolded under dim amber light. Isabelle stared at it. Her heart clenched. She recognized the hair. The posture. Though the image was blurred, she knew it was her 3 years ago at a small concert in Krakow. The last time she'd performed blindfolded, playing a caprice in total darkness. "We saw the video," Darcourt said, voice almost gentle. "Very few have the courage to tie silk over their eyes and let music lead." Isabelle's hands tightened. She'd promised never to use that trick again, because after that performance, she'd been dismissed as a gimmick, a showpiece, a viral stunt. But all she had wanted was to know if she could still hear music truly when all that remained was touch and memory. "But now," Darcourt continued, "you no longer need the blindfold for them to listen." He slid a pale blue envelope across the desk. "Invitation officielle Philharmonie de Paris. Isabelle Mercier. Program, Solo d'Iovica, Nuit de Renaissances." Isabelle stared at the text. "No accompanist? No ensemble? Solo? You're not on the margins anymore," Darcourt said. "You're the opening chapter." That night, back in the flat, Isabelle opened her old notebook and added one more line at the bottom of the final page. "Paris, where music without pedigree was heard for the first time like a triumph." She didn't know how the audience would react, but for the first time she wasn't afraid. Not because she had been accepted, but because she had finally stepped into the light under her real name. The performance was a week away, and this time every light would be on. That night, Paris wore a different skin. Not the golden glow of old bookshops nor the soft red of Montparnasse cafes, but a charged stillness, like the breath before a storm, or a door creaking open onto the unknown. At Philharmonie de Paris, crimson velvet seats filled steadily, not just with critics and patrons, but with those who once doubted the magic in hands born outside the system. Isabelle Mercier stepped backstage, fingers tightening slightly around her violin case. No jewelry, no lipstick, no stylist, Only a simple black dress, a guarneri restored by her own hands, and a crisp program. Newt de Renaissance's Solo d'Ovicia, Isabelle Mercier. She could hear the murmur of the crowd through layers of soundproofing. No mocking whispers like at Ardo. No glances at her glasses or worn shoes. No longer the girl outside the frame. Here, the only thing they knew was she would play. Alone. From the wings, Aiko, Lars, and Nadia stood together. They weren't performing tonight. They were there not out of duty but something deeper. A witness to a voice that had finally found its shape and dared to speak. A stagehand gave the signal. Isabelle nodded. She stepped past the velvet curtain as it slowly parted. Into a beam of cold, circular light. Unforgiving, clear. This time she didn't cover her eyes. She didn't need to. She took her place center stage. Bowed. No background music. No accompaniment. No introduction. And then she played. The opening piece. Fugue sur l'éclat, a fractured solo full of jagged runs. Tones stretched tight like the breath before a life-altering decision. The first moments were taut, each note clawing space into silence. But then the music opened, expanding, blooming. Isabelle wasn't just playing. She was guiding. She played each phrase like a lived memory. The buoyant lilt in 3/4 like her first steps into the Ardo dormitory, violin in hand. The icy tremolo echoing Koenig's silent erasure of her name. And then the sudden pause, a low note falling like a wound, when she stood in the spotlight and no one called her name. But from that note, the melody soared. High notes burst like affirmations. Every double stop rang clear. She wasn't playing to convince. She was playing because she believed. When the final note faded, no one clapped right away. Not from lack of emotion, but because the room held its breath, afraid to break what had just happened. Then a single pair of hands began to clap. Soft. Then another. Then a third. And suddenly, like a tide, the Philharmonie stood up. The upper balconies whispered like a forest caught in wind. A sustained, genuine ovation, not showy, but true. In the wings, Etienne Darcourt stood motionless, hands clasped behind his back. He didn't smile, but his eyes were wet. No one knew he had once told Rossetti. This girl will never make them believe unless she abandons her past. Now he understood. She didn't need to abandon anything. She had turned it into music. Far in the back row, a woman in a gray coat sat still. Professor Elena Rossetti. No one had seen her leave Ardo. No one noticed her rise. But her hand resting on her lap beat out the encore's rhythm. Her eyes shimmered with something rare. Pride. Isabelle bowed, then stepped off stage. Aiko embraced her like porcelain. Lars patted her twice on the shoulder, whispering, "They'll remember that. Forever." She said nothing, still holding the violin. No longer just an instrument, but a witness to a journey no one thought could exist. Outside, Paris was still drizzling, but Isabelle carried no umbrella. She walked alone along the stone sidewalks, unhurried, unafraid of the rain. On her shoulder, the violin case was warm. In her chest, something stirred. Not an ending, but a rebirth. And that night, in the rain of Paris, she knew. For the first time, no one could cross her name off the list again. News of Isabelle Mercier's unannounced opening solo spread faster than the privileged students of Ardo could post their curated hashtags. No press release, no post-concert interview, just a grainy phone video shot by a guest and shared inside a private classical music forum, the old playground of Europe's musical elite. 24 hours later, her name appeared in a short Le Monde piece. An untitled solo, a resurrection for the forgotten generation. Somewhere in Ardo's great hall, Maestro Adrian Koenig slammed the newspaper onto his mahogany desk, hot espresso splattering across the photo of Isabelle bowing under the white lights of the Philharmonie. He said nothing, but the pen in his fist cracked at the barrel. In the faculty lounge, Professor Elena Rossetti sat alone, tapping a rhythm on the armrest. She didn't need the newspaper. She had been in Paris, had heard every note, every shoulder movement, every G-string vibration that erased her last doubt. Isabelle Mercier had outgrown the status of student. She was no longer a special case. She was a phenomenon, not glamorous, simply impossible to ignore. When Dr. Hugo Sattler entered, he carried a stack of new term applications. 18 more foreign candidates, he said, flipping pages. 6 of them wrote, "I want to study where Mercier studied." Rossetti raised an eyebrow. She was never our typical student. Exactly, Sattler replied. That's the problem. In the courtyard, second years clustered around the midterm ranking board. Celia Beaumont stepped out of class in her cream cashmere coat and pale red lipstick, but the eyes following her were no longer purely admiring. "Have you watched it?" One student whispered, phone in hand. She played Fugue sur l'éclat like it was written for her. They say Rossetti never meant to publish the piece. They say Koenig once cut Mercier from the orchestra. They say. Rumor is music without staves, everyone hums along. Celia showed no reaction, yet back in her room she slammed the door so hard it rattled the stand holding her unfinished sonata. Meanwhile, Isabelle returned to Strasbourg, no fanfare, no welcome. In her old gray coat she wheeled a suitcase through wind-stained streets and mossy alleys. Instead of the dormitory, she headed straight for the north wing to the brass-plated door marked Salle de Maîtres, faculty and visiting artists only. She knocked 3 times. Thibaut Marin opened the door. He didn't look surprised. He didn't ask why. He simply stepped aside. Inside, afternoon light filled a room with a single empty desk. On the wall hung the timetable for senior masterclasses. One slot was blank. Rossetti left an appointment, Thibaut said. 1 month. Seminar, liberating emotion from form. He met her eyes. You'll teach. Isabelle didn't nod at once. She studied the board in silence, then answered. No. I won't teach. I'll let them find their own way to play. Better, Thibaut said. We don't need more copyists. He walked away, leaving her alone in the bright room. For the first time, she no longer needed permission to stand before others and be heard. That night, word spread that Mercier was returning as a guest instructor. Some pursed lips, some raised brows. But a first-year girl, cropped hair, from a village near Marseille went to practice room 7, where Isabelle had once played under the leaky roof. She slipped a note under the door. I don't own fine dresses, but I have the violin my father built and a real dream. Next morning Isabelle found the note, read it, then repinned it neatly. Beside it she wrote, Good. Bring the violin. Start from silence. Ardo didn't change in a day. Noble surnames still hung on the walls, academic treatises still weighed down shelves. But from room 7, with nameless scores and notes that needed no one's permission, a crack had appeared. No one knew how long it would take to spread. Only that it had begun. Room 7. Once forgotten, leaking roof, warped floorboards, wiring that sparked like a panicked heartbeat. Room 7 now overflowed with real sound, music unfiltered by selection committees, unpolished for juries, existing only to say what no one dared voice. Isabelle's seminar, no title, no dress code, no grades, opened with one rule. You will not play to be accepted. You will play to accept yourself. The first session drew 5 students. The first-year girl from Marseille. A shaggy-haired Portuguese boy rejected for wrong tempo. A third-year cellist whose strings were patched with tape. And 2 others, one silent, one shy. Isabelle didn't climb a podium or raise her voice. She set down her violin and said, Let's begin with silence. And with the notes they once told you never to play. Ripples. In the director's office, silence took on its own sound. Koenig tracked the weekly audit list for Isabelle's class. 5, then 12, then 17, some of them ex-first chair players who had once laughed when she was rejected. She isn't teaching technique, he growled in a faculty meeting. She's creating a chain reaction, an emotional cult without discipline. Rossetti closed her notebook. Sometimes technique is just a ribbon on an empty box. She's teaching how to give the sound a soul. Sattler added quietly, 30 years of teaching, Adrian. I've never seen students voluntarily pack a practice room outside mandatory hours. In rehearsals, Celia Beaumont was no longer the center of conversation. When asked to play a Bach partita, she executed every beat flawlessly. Yet when she finished, the class stayed silent, not out of awe, but because nothing lingered. That evening she stood outside room 7, listening. Isabelle was coaching the young girl through a tricky phrase in Caprice number 11. Don't let the hand lead the heart, Isabelle said. Let the feeling guide the hand. Celia did not enter, but before leaving she slid a note under the door. If I feel nothing anymore, should I still play? Next morning a new line appeared beneath it. If you're brave enough to ask, you've already begun. The open experiment. A week later Ardo revived its old, neglected tradition, the open experimental concert where students could present unfinished arrangements. This year, the main hall was full, not for tradition, but for the rumor. Mercier will choose 2 students who have never been on stage to perform with her. When the lights rose, Isabelle stepped out with 2 newcomers, Leo, the curly-haired cellist, and Camille, an 18-year-old of Algerian descent playing a violin held together with tape. No speeches. No introductions. They played a Bartok excerpt rearranged as a call-and response, instruments conversing, hesitant, then fierce, then dissolving into each other. It was not perfect, a few wrong notes, a lapse in tempo. But no one looked away. And when they ended, the applause didn't start with the faculty, it erupted from the students. From those who had laughed, whispered, dismissed the presence of someone who didn't fit. That night Isabel sat alone in room 7, not playing, just staring at a blank score. Thibault arrived with the next term roster, 24 students. One name in bold. Celia Beaumont, reason for enrollment, I want to hear my violin again. Isabel didn't smile, she simply nodded. Send it to Rossetti. She'll understand. So at Erdo, once a place that chose by lineage and lacquer cases, practice room doors no longer stayed shut every morning. The sounds were broken, strained, hesitant, but real. They no longer asked permission. They had begun to play. Room 7 had once been a forgotten place. A leaking roof. A warped floor. Wires that occasionally sparked, making the lights flicker like a frightened heartbeat. But ever since Isabel Mercier set her violin down in that room, it had become crowded with real sound, music that hadn't passed through a selection panel, hadn't been polished to please a jury, but existed only to speak what no one else dared say. Her seminar, nameless, uniformless, gradeless, began with one single condition. You will not play to be accepted. You will play to accept yourself. The first session had only 5 students. A first-year girl from Marseille. A shaggy-haired boy from Portugal who had once been rejected from the orchestra for being off-tempo. A third-year cellist using self-wrapped strings because he couldn't afford a new set. And 2 others, one quiet, one timid. At the center was Isabel. She didn't stand on a podium, didn't raise her voice. She simply placed her violin down and said, "We begin with silence. And with the notes you were once told never to play." Meanwhile, in the headmaster's office, silence had also begun to make sound. Maestro Koenig was tracking the rising number of audit requests for Isabel's class. From 5 to 12, then 17. Among them were names of former first-chair students, the very ones who once laughed when Isabel was rejected. She's not teaching technique, he growled during a faculty meeting. She's triggering a chain reaction. An emotional cult with no discipline. Professor Elena Rossetti closed her notebook, offering no argument. But she replied quietly. Sometimes technique is just a ribbon on an empty box. She's teaching how to give music a soul. Dr. Sattler added just one line. I've taught for decades, Adrian. I've never seen students voluntarily show up to practice rooms like this during unassigned hours. Out in the courtyard, Celia Beaumont was no longer the center of conversations. In rehearsal, when asked to perform a Bach partita, she played every beat flawlessly, missing not a single note. But when she finished, the room stayed silent. Not out of reverence, but because nothing lingered. That night, she went to room 7. She didn't knock. She stood outside and listened. Inside, Isabel was guiding a young girl through a phrasing section in Caprice number 11. Don't let your hands lead your heart, Isabel said. Let feeling lead your hands. Celia didn't enter. But before she left, she slipped a note under the door. If I don't feel anything anymore, should I still play? The next morning, beneath that line, a new one had appeared. If you're brave enough to ask that, you've already begun. A week later, Ardo held its annual open trial concert, an old tradition few cared about, where students could present unfinished arrangements. This year, the hall was full. Not because of the tradition, but because of a rumor. Mercier will choose 2 students who've never performed on stage to play with her. When the stage lights came on, Isabel walked out with 2 students. Leo, the curly-haired cellist, and Camille, an 18-year-old girl of Algerian descent playing an old violin patched with tape. No words were spoken. No names were announced. They performed a rearranged excerpt from Bartok, structured as a call-and response. Each instrument spoke like in conversation, hesitant, bold, then dissolving into one another. It wasn't perfect. A few missed notes. A skipped beat. But no one looked away. And when it ended, the applause didn't come from faculty. It came from students. The ones who once laughed. Once whispered. Once denied the presence of someone who didn't fit. That night, Isabel sat alone in room 7. She didn't play. Just stared at a blank sheet of music. Thibault Marin came in, carrying the registration list for the next session. 24 names. One in bold. Celia Beaumont, reason for applying, I want to hear my sound again. Isabel didn't smile. She only nodded. Send it to Rossetti. She'll understand. And so, at Erdo, a place that once selected by surname and instrument case brand. Each morning now opened with practice room doors left ajar. Sounds that cracked, gasped, faltered, but were real. They no longer asked permission. They had begun to play. April arrived earlier than usual in Strasbourg. Pale golden sunlight filtered through the tree arches lining the path into Ardo, revealing old moss clinging to the Paganini statue and time-worn bricks of the courtyard. But something had changed, not just in the light, but in the way the academy breathed. The once echoing hallways, filled with hurried footsteps, now occasionally resonated with something unfamiliar: laughter. The practice rooms, once sealed off, now stood slightly ajar, leaking broken, honest fragments of music. And Room 7, once the peripheral edge of everything, had become the center of a movement without a name. One Monday morning, Isabel entered her class as usual, violin in hand, hair tied low, a simple linen dress. But today she didn't teach. "We won't play anyone else's music today," she said, setting down her guarneri. "Today, each of you will write one phrase of your own. Just one. But it must be a phrase no one ever taught you to write." The class went silent. Not out of difficulty, but unfamiliarity. To write a note, not for credit, not to prove skill, but to express what no one had ever asked: "What do you truly hear when the world is quiet?" Camille spoke first. "I don't know how to write." "Then remember," Isabel said, "the moment you don't know is the moment you're most honest." At the same time, in the faculty room, Maestro Adrian Koenig was holding a closed meeting. On the table lay a folder titled, "Admissions Policy Reform Proposal, Prioritize Candidates with Highest Theoretical Aptitude." He presented with a cold tone: "There is a growing confusion between personal experience and true art. Ardo is an academy, not a place for emotional healing." Some faculty nodded. But not all. Rossetti, arms folded, her eyes unusually bright, said evenly, "Adrian, you still believe technique is the foundation." "I don't object. But if technique can't carry a story, it's just an empty shell. And if students are afraid to tell their story, then what are we really teaching?" Koenig did not reply. But the look he gave her, cold and sharp as a Stradivarius blade, said enough. For him, the war had never ended. That afternoon, Isabel received a thick envelope from the administration office. Inside was an official notice: offer of full-time appointment, interim professor for the upcoming term. She read every line, folded the letter, and slipped it into a cloth pouch on her chair. No one saw her cry, nor smile. But behind her glasses there was a new light in her eyes, not a flame, but the enduring glow of something no longer afraid to be extinguished. That weekend, Ardo hosted a quiet event, Soirée Sans Nom, the nameless recital. No posters. No programs. No seating by rank. Anyone could play, but only what they'd written themselves: a phrase, a passage, a lingering echo. When Isabel stepped into the makeshift garden stage, she carried no instrument. She sat at the edge, listening. Camille was the first to step forward. She gave no introduction. She played a simple melody, slow, raw, like the voice of a child unaware it's being heard. Then came Leo. Then a fourth-year student, once a concertmaster, who had never dared compose before. Then, unexpectedly, Celia Beaumont. No one was surprised. No one laughed. She stood in the center, bowed her head, and began to play a solo that echoed Bach, but wasn't Bach, as if trying to retrieve a forgotten ancient tongue to tell her own story. When she stopped, there was no applause, only understanding. Isabel met her gaze, nodded subtly. Celia nodded back, no longer a rival, but a fellow speaker. That night, after everyone had left, Rossetti found her way to room 7. She didn't knock. Isabel was writing something on the board, a quote. "La vérité n'est pas à l'unison." Truth is not played in unison. Rossetti read it, stood quietly. Then she said, "That quote, it's not in any official curriculum." Isabel smiled. Neither were many of the sounds once forbidden here. Rossetti placed a hand on her shoulder. "But now we are listening." And so, within Ardo, among ancient sonatas and stacked violin manuals, something new had begun to ring. Not because it was allowed. Not to please anyone. But because at last, the real notes dared to sound without harmony, without permission. May arrived, coating the Ardo grounds with white chestnut blossoms. The trees, long silent through winter, now whispered with the wind as if relearning how to pronounce themselves. End-of-term air was always thick with exhaustion and display, scholarship showcases, international exchange forms, judges flown in from elite conservatories. But this year, in every conversation, the name most mentioned wasn't on the official program. Isabel Mercier, now a full interim professor, did not perform any solo. Took no official advisory role. Did not sit on any judging panel. She spent her time in room 7, doors open each afternoon for anyone who wished to enter, not to be taught, but to relearn how to hear their own sound. One evening, Thibaut Marin stepped in with a black-wax sealed letter, an honorary invitation from the French Council of Musical Heritage, naming Isabel as the featured performer at the memorial concert for Edmond Ardo, the Academy's founder. A grand event. Live broadcast. ministers and renowned conductors across Europe. Isabel read the letter as if it belonged to a past that no longer included her. "I won't perform," she said quietly. Thibaut frowned. "They want you." "No," Isabel replied. "They want a symbol. A flute tune to show the world Ardo has changed. But if they truly had, they wouldn't need me on stage to prove it." Thibaut stayed silent, then nodded as if finally understanding. Her strength didn't come from being seen, but from knowing when not to appear. The ceremony still took place. A stage of ornate beauty. A 50-piece string section. Lights calibrated to 0.1 lux precision. A fourth-year student, one who had taken a single term with Isabel, was chosen to perform. But what everyone remembered wasn't the performance. It was the moment after. As lights dimmed, the crowd dispersed, and from a quiet corner of the school a small sound emerged, like the whisper of someone finally saying what had never been voiced. A group of students, no uniforms, no spotlight, gathered around the old library piano. Celia Beaumont played a new solo. Not to prove progress, but to tell of a time she felt lost. Camille accompanied with her violin. Leo plucked his cello gently. No live stream. No cameras. Isabel watched from afar, in shadow. She didn't step in. She didn't record. She simply listened. And for the first time in years, she allowed herself not to be the one who played, but the one who received. Rossetti stood beside her. "They won't know how important this moment is until years from now." "That's okay," Isabel said. "Because it happened." Summer came. Graduates left Ardo carrying with them heritage and questions. Some pursued the stage. Some abandoned their instruments. Some began to write. But wherever they went, someone carried an unnamed thing, something born in room 7 with no score and no standard, the courage to voice the truth. Ardo was no longer what it had been. But it had not dramatically transformed. No grand revolution. Only a quiet shift, like an old violin being restrung, its shape unchanged, only its tension rewound. On the final evening of the term, Isabel stayed late in the practice room. She opened an old notebook, turned to the first page where her mother had once written in purple ink. "You don't need someone to hear you to know you're singing. But if someone stops, give them a reason to remember." She took up a pen and added one final line. "Sometimes the truest sound isn't the loudest. It's the one they still remember after it has faded." Then she closed the notebook, set it on the desk, and stepped outside. Room 7 remained open. No one waited for her. But no one stood in the way of the music anymore. May draped the Ardo campus in white chestnut blossoms. Branches that had stayed silent all winter now rustled in the wind, as if they too were learning their first words. End-of-term air was always thick with fatigue and showmanship, scholarship showcases, exchange program applications, guest jurors from famed conservatories. Yet this year, in every conversation, the name spoken most often never appeared on the official program. Isabel Mercier, now a full-time adjunct lecturer, played no solo, accepted no formal advisory post, and sat on no jury. She spent her days in room 7, its door open each afternoon to anyone who wished to enter, not to be taught, but to relearn how to hear their own playing. One afternoon, Thibaut Marin arrived carrying an envelope sealed with black wax, a formal invitation from the French Musical Heritage Council naming Isabel principal soloist at the memorial for Edmond Ardo, the Academy's founder. The event would be broadcast live, attended by the Minister of Culture and veteran conductors from across Europe. Isabel looked at the letter as though it belonged to a past she no longer inhabited. "I won't play," she murmured. "They want you," Thibaut insisted. "No," Isabel replied. "They want a symbol, a showpiece to prove that Ardo has changed. If the change were real, they wouldn't need me at center stage to demonstrate it." Thibaut fell silent, then nodded as if finally grasping that her strength lay not in being seen but in knowing when not to appear. The ceremony went on. The stage was lavish, the string section swelled to 50 players, every spotlight calibrated within 0.1 lux. A fourth-year student, once enrolled for a single term in Isabel's class, was named the official soloist. Yet what people remembered was not the performance, but the moment after the program ended. Lights dimmed, the crowd drifted away, and from a corner of the campus rose a quiet sound, like the whisper of someone daring at last to speak. A group of students, no uniforms, no spotlights, gathered around the old library piano. Celia Beaumont played a newly written solo, not to prove progress but to tell of a time she had been lost. Camille joined on violin, Leo plucked the cello. No one live-streamed. No one took photos. Isabel stood at a distance, in the dark, neither entering nor recording, simply listening. For the first time in many years she allowed herself not to be the one who played, but the one who listened. Rossetti stepped beside her. "They won't know how important this moment is for a few years yet." That's all right, Isabel said. Because it already happened. Summer arrived. Graduates left Ardo carrying both its legacy and their questions. Some pursued the stage, some set their instruments aside, some began to write. Yet each departed with something nameless, born in room 7 with no transcript and no rubric, the courage to let a true voice ring. Ardo was no longer the same, nor had it been reborn in dazzling colors. There was no earth-shaking revolution, only a quiet shift like an old instrument restaurant, its shape unchanged, only the tension altered. On the final evening of the term, Isabel stayed late in the practice room. She opened an old notebook to the first page where her mother had once written in violet ink. You don't need anyone to listen to know that you were singing. But if someone stops, give them a reason to remember. Isabel added one last line. Sometimes the truest sound is not the loudest, but the one people still recall after it has faded. She closed the notebook, set it on the table, and stepped outside. Room 7 remained open. No one awaited her, but no one silenced the music anymore. A year passed, and the venerable school entered the strangest era in its history. No clear center of power, no favored protégés, no official program left unquestioned. In their place something else was growing, not flashy, not loud, yet spreading like groundwater through ancient stone. Isabel Mercier, now a tenured professor, kept the same shabby office on the 3rd floor, plaster peeling and window askew. She did not move to the polished faculty wing with coffee machines at every desk. From that office she could see practice room 7, and she still believed the most important place at Ardo was never where one teaches, but where someone dares to play for the first time in their own way. At the first week, faculty meeting, her name topped the list of fully booked classes. The fact did not make Isabel proud, but it did make Koenig, across the table, close his grade book and look away. Rossetti passed her in the corridor afterward. A slight nod and brush of fingers said everything music could say. That autumn, a first-year named Mina Khaled, the daughter of a Marseille dockworker, petitioned to transfer from theory to performance, though she had never held an instrument. I'm not sure I will play well, she wrote, but I want to know whether my voice, even offbeat, can be heard. No one dared approve the request until Isabel placed it on the dean's desk beside a yellowing copy of her own first-year papers where a similar sentence had once been scrawled. Give her a practice room, Isabel said. Not because she is ready, but because she dares to step in uninvited. 3 weeks later, Mina played Meditation de Face before the class, missing 4 notes, skipping 2 beats, yet surely, clearly, without hiding. The room stayed silent to the end, then Celia, now Isabel's teaching assistant, was the first to applaud. At an informal end-of-term gathering in the back courtyard, no gowns, no stage, just an old piano and strings of amber lights, a third-year shyly asked, "Will you write a book, ma'am? We need to keep the way you taught." Isabel smiled and shook her head. "No. This doesn't belong to me. It began with a crack, and each of you must let your own sound flow through it. Then what will you leave us?" She looked up at the darkening Strasbourg sky. A door forever ajar. A practice room unlocked. And a nameless board. Months later, a new teacher passed room 7 and saw a small wooden plaque on the wall, no ornament, no gilded frame, chalked words alone. True music needs no stage. Music true enough is the stage. Who wrote that? The teacher asked. No one answered. Everyone knew, and no one needed to sign. Thus, in a school once famed for its curated music, another legacy took quiet shape. No bust, no scholarship bearing a name, no newspaper proclaiming a revolution. Only a new generation, an old room, and young people who stepped forward at last with instruments in hand and voices that no longer had to ask permission.